Welcome, everyone, to today's virtual panel. I want to start just by thanking Frank and Maria for joining. This is going to be an exceptional conversation. Love the energy that these speakers have, and I really appreciate them taking the time to join us. We're going to be speaking about the criminal exploitation of fear using frontier technologies, and I think you'll find it fascinating. I certainly do. I want to remind everyone that the Q&A button is your friend. I'd love for everyone to use that regularly. Post your questions in there. The speakers and myself will be able to see the questions, and we'll answer them as they come in. So get your questions in early. And I'm going to let Frank and Maria give introductions for themselves. Before I do that, I wanted to just review or acknowledge the big news that we shared this week about Fintech Nexus and Fintech Meetup. As most of you in the audience know, we have had a large scale event in the spring every year since 2013, and this past event in 2023 is now sort of our last large scale event in the United States. We've signed an agreement with Fintech Meetup. They will be hosting the large scale event in the US in the springtime next year, and we've partnered with them to make sure that's a huge success. That'll be in Las Vegas on March 3rd through 6th. And meanwhile, Fintech Nexus will be accelerating into the digital world with events and activities just like this. We have over 200,000 people in our community right now: professionals, founders, investors, CEOs, bankers, credit union executives, you name it, and of course, fraud fighters. So I'm going to hand the baton over to Frank. Frank, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then Maria can give her background, and then we'll kick it off with how did we get here? What's the state of things in the industry? Take it away, Frank.
Yeah, thank you, Bo. And Maria, always a pleasure to be chopping it up. So thanks for joining. For our honored participants, it's going to be fantastic. Always delighted to get a forum of professionals together to understand what's happening in the marketplace. I am a longtime cybersecurity guy, been at this for a long time in very different roles and functions, starting way back with Threat Metrics, where we were, really the pioneers of digital identity, and saw that through to an acquisition with LexisNexis. Now at Arcos Labs, where we really focus on the idea of fighting volumetric, sophisticated bot attacks, and also sophisticated fraud farms, people fraud farms. So we have a fantastic crossover with our install base, Maria, as it relates to the participants here today, because we deal a lot with fintech. Along that journey, Bo, Maria, and colleagues have worn many hats: CIO, CFO, COO, CEO, you name it. But I've really been privileged in this business to be at the forefront of watching this industry develop, and also being involved with Arcos in interdicting and helping our customers manage those volumetric attacks, which are incessant. And we'll talk about that throughout the presentation. Also, for really for leadership purposes and developing next generation of leaders, I really have a passion for teaching. I've been an adjunct professor at the Santa Clara University Levy School of Business for the last almost 13 years, where I'm part of the MBA program and the MSIS program. So delighted to be here. Maria, with that, I hand the baton to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Maria, and I help lead the threat intelligence team over at Bill. Bill is a business-to-business payments platform. So we provide spend and expense management solution, payables, and acquiring products to our customers, which are SMBs all throughout the United States. My background is in fraud investigations and intelligence and cybercrime. I spent a little bit of time working for the City of New York District Attorney's Office in the cybercrime unit, and then about 8 years working in fintech payment fraud specifically. And my team currently is responsible for doing root cause analysis and really getting an in-depth, grounded understanding of what kind of fraud our platform experiences. I enjoy joining these kind of collaborative discussions, and really love when the community comes together to really talk about what's happening, right? We're maybe coming from different companies, but we share mutual, I don't want to say enemy, but we share a mutual threat. And so having these kind of open discussions and conversations, I think really helps us all become stronger and more effective in taking this knowledge and intelligence back to our internal companies.
Yeah, 100%.
Excellent. So let's dive in. How did we get here, and where are we anyway? What's the state of affairs in these large scale attacks?
Yeah, it's interesting, Marie. I'll jump in and then happy to have you kind of maybe talk also about what you're seeing. But from our perspective, we have a broad range of enterprise clients that really cover fintechs, financial services broadly defined, e-commerce companies, anybody who's online. What we're seeing, Bo, that's so interesting. If you look at the number of attacks, in our world, especially bot-driven attacks, they're dramatically increasing year over year. We're looking at an environment where the fraudsters are using crime as a service services, pun intended, which are large scale opportunities very cheaply to take information and manipulate that information to try to attack our customers. We see those attacks going through the roof, and they're up significantly year over year. And specifically in fintech, our fintech cohort of customers, we've seen a 350% just so far relative to last year increase in attacks on those customers. So, Maria, I know everybody's feeling it. Fintech in particular, because to Bo's question, I think what gets us here is there's a real dynamic tension in the fintech world between acting like an e-com company and being a regulated financial institution. You're kind of in this world where you juggle both. And so oftentimes in an effort to limit the amount of friction imposed on new visiting, new registrants and new people coming in, you create these kind of gray areas where the adversary and fraudsters can attack. But all in all, Maria, we're seeing a massive increase on every indicator that we look at. We track something called the bot abuse index at Arcos, and that index just continues to go up and to the right, every year.
Yeah, I think if we maybe just start focusing on automated unscripted activity, we definitely experience and see increased pressure in that. I think it's bound. Some of these attacks, I guess there's a common name in the industry called like SMS pumping. And then there's also another one called random deposit abuse. So some of these things you don't see if you're maybe a newer company, you're just starting out here because your name isn't out there, or maybe fraudsters haven't discovered you. But slowly but surely, what they do is just they tend to move from one company to another and find a weak point and kind of run these scripted automated attacks that for a while can go undetected. But even if they are detected, I could speak from kind of our own experience. You might just see a spike in signups and they're not doing anything. Like they're not trying to move money. Yeah. They're not trying to do anything really. And so you're like, well, why are we having so many dummy, let's just call them junk accounts created? It makes no sense. And then long behold, you realize, oh, wow. Okay. So they're exploiting our two-factor gate, and so they just like create accounts just so they can send a token, or they just keep on adding bank accounts just so they can get that random deposit abuse. So it's definitely an increase in the diversity of the attacks, the number of the attacks, but also kind of just the discovery of them. It takes a little bit of a while, and I think it's really it's a crucial point for sure.
Yeah, Maria, it's interesting you mentioned SMS pumping. SMS toll fraud is also another phrase for it. What's unique for our colleagues and participants here, and you just mentioned it, one of the attributes that's key to that attack vector is that they abandon the workflow. They're not really there to get in and compromise, the company, the network to scrape money. They're getting paid by colluding, carriers overseas. They get together with the fraudsters and they go, hey, if I can send a text message to XY, to Bill.com from Kazakhstan, right? The carrier is going to pay me 40 cents a text. So let's get into anywhere where there's an SMS presence. Let's take that. Let's feed legitimate numbers into it. And then to your point, what's so interesting about that attack vector is that the people that are in charge of the Marcus programs that are stimulating registration, they go, wow, look at this toll bill. Right? The cell bill has gone up. It must mean a lot of accounts are signing up. And you wind up with really interesting attributes. Number one, there's an abandonment of transaction workflow. Number two, they understand, the fraudsters are clever. They understand that there's nobody connecting the cell bill increase to the registration increase for months at a time. So you have this really weird gap where fraudsters can monetize the information. They take these accounts, they monetize them, that goes back to the carrier. The carrier gives them 10%. Typically, the carrier keeps 90%. And you start thinking about it at volume. If I'm getting 40 cents a hit and the fraudster's taking a nickel basically for every one, do that by millions, it's a huge lucrative business. And that's one that we see, constantly that right now, Maria, is a huge attack vector, irrespective of industry. It's hitting everybody because it's so easy to do and so difficult to stop unless you really have an understanding of velocities, those numbers, regions, and you're seeing kind of persistently across a broader network that activity. The target company is, in our estimation, in our experience, typically 4 to 5 months before they realize they've been hit.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I would actually use the experience that we've had as a prime example for that. We've been seeing this, and interestingly, like I came from a larger company before this, and we had this abuse, and it was rampant, and it cost a lot, and it took a while to put controls in place because they're not like using one carrier, and they're not using one country, they're everywhere, right? And because it takes a little bit of time to discover. By the time that you found it, they've got, country, they're all over the world, and they've got tons of carriers, and they just have shared this, that, this is a company, they don't have good controls with all their buddies. And so you've got like not a single group after you, but you've got multiple groups, and it takes a while to take control in place. But I think like the most important part is also like knowing to look for this, right? Like, how can you get ahead of this? Is like, this can happen. So this can happen. So that like you should be like measuring how many tokens you're sending out. Like if you're, normally sending 1 million and all of a sudden you're sending 5 million.
That's right.
Well, what's happening there?
And having that feedback loop, Maria, where like, you go back to the people on the marketing side and you go, hey, I just sent out 5 million tokens. What are we seeing in terms of registration? And having a real-time feedback loop is super important because, again, that we talked about this, I think many times, but the social network of these people, you just said it, they find they're able to kind of manipulate a situation like an SMS workflow. Then they tell everybody. Right, it's out there on all the channels. Everybody knows how to do it. There's in these small companies, carriers that are more than willing to participate. And I think you're right. I think having a feedback loop, understanding what you're doing on the protection detection side of the business, and then going back and correlating that to the people that are driving the programs and saying, hey, we're seeing a huge amount of transactions coming from a region that's unexpected, right? Or coming from 3 or 4 regions where normally the registrations haven't been great. Are you seeing legitimate signups and getting ahead of it, both through technology? As I said, Arcos deals with this constantly, but also through individual and internal communication to correlate interdiction responses by your team, along with market stimulus that's being put out by the marketing folks, is really interesting. But yeah, definitely a really clever threat vector, and again, creative people, right? Amazingly creative adversaries.
Yeah, financially motivated, but also very opportunistic. Right, they're seeking out like companies that may not know about this and may not have controls for this. But I think, speaking about opportunistic attackers, and most of these will likely be located overseas, where even a small amount financially, to us, $40,000 is not a huge loss in the grand scheme of things, right? But where they're located, that's a lot of money. And kind of doing this on a regular basis, it's just very profitable, right? So I think another one kind of very similar to us in the grand scheme of things, doesn't look like, we're going to have huge losses from this unless this really scales over time, but like random deposit abuse, right? Like, so something that we've seen this on like a funding bank account that gets added, but also interestingly, like no one thought to look at this, but this could also be done on billing bank accounts, like the bank accounts that get charged a subscription. You've normally like, okay, customers expected to just like put one bank account or card for billing. Why would they put 100 or 300? Or why would they put the same bank 10 times? And so these are all like, again, it's interesting, like how they exploit these various flows within the product, parts of the product that normally you would not expect to be abused. And so as a fraud team or a team that develops controls, this is not the area that you're going to focus in your attentions for, like your vendors, where you want to screen on and like check on, like these aren't the actual like points potentially. And so I think it's also really like key on identifying what are the potential ways that these things can be abused.
Yeah, and again, back to the creativity. Think about it, Maria. So it makes sense to maybe have 2 or 3 cards. And so somebody in the workflow, I can imagine when that workflow is being developed, somebody said, let's not limit the ability for legitimate cards to be placed on this account, right? And that information somehow gets socialized out into that community, and they realize, hey, why not load it up with 100? Right. And again, so understanding that the card ratio, the ratio of cards per account relative to what's actually being used. Again, back to your point, a great internal check. I think it's really interesting, Bo, as we talk through this, Maria and I kind of living it. just understand that the dynamism involved in these threats and these attackers. They're not stagnant. They don't, they're not, back to the future. They're doing something new every time. And oftentimes, Maria, that exploitation is based on understanding the intricacies of the organization, which is remarkable. Like, how does this place function and work? And I think that's one of the things where you realize that these adversaries, are really privy to so much information that's out there and easily available, and very, very cheap, that to be able to attack en masse used to be a very difficult, expensive thing. Today, it's a very easy, cheap thing to get the information, to get out there and perpetuate these attacks. Our estimation just this year, I know these numbers get bounced around the industry, but there's somewhere north of 30 billion active accounts that have been compromised with information that's readily available to people to be able to use to either create fake accounts, to monopolize cards, to use domains and IPs, you name it, that information's out there. And when you combine that information with, easily accessible robots that are able to just en masse attack, that creates, to your point, a very, very lucrative and cheap attack vector, where, again, if you're sitting in parts of the world where the daily, income that somebody makes is a couple, $3 a day, it's an incredibly meaningful revenue stream for them, with very little real world consequences, because the chances of any physical consequence in that region isn't going to happen. So you really have to rely on process and technology to really stop these things and to be predictive and get ahead of it.
Let me jump in and ask a question, because at risk of interrupting your great flow, which I knew was going to be fantastic. So I want to hear a little bit about, Maria, how your team, how you develop your team, the skills that you need, the size of your team, what your budget looks like in terms of like increasing, decreasing, pressures you have there, because this is very clearly an arms race, right? This is warfare. And then similarly, so Frank, you've got you're a technology provider to these B2B fintechs like Bill. And so how do you interact? And similar questions for you, like, how are you staying ahead of the game? This is a really intensive environment. And frankly, are we gaining ground or are we losing ground? So I just threw a lot at you. Oh, one other thing, audience, I haven't seen any questions yet. Get in there and ask questions. I shouldn't be the only one here asking questions and prodding these experts. So Maria, I just threw a whole 6 or 7 questions at you at once. Just pick the one you want to answer and go for it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll try there. So our team is uniquely positioned. We're in the intersection between our strategy that puts in controls, our operations, which is our front line, and our risk analytics, which kind of does our metrics, builds rules, etc. What our team's main focus is doing root cause analysis. So if we have an incident, we have a fraud case, something happened, our focus is to kind of traverse backwards and uncover exactly what the breakdown was. How did the fraudster perpetrate the activity? Evaluate the sophistication of the attacker, right? Because we also kind of want to understand, is this somebody who's just opportunistic or somebody who's really sophisticated, knows what's going on? And if we believe that this is somebody who's relatively sophisticated, we're bound to find other connections and other attempts. And so we take a lot of the insights that we find and we we use these to kind of form intelligence briefs and inform our team on these are the rising vectors. This is how they're maybe getting through. This is their motivation, and kind of work with all the stakeholders in order to inform and put in controls to address. I think the important part is doing that qualitative understanding of what is actually happening, because a lot of the times when you just look at the numbers, they may not tell you what's actually really happening. They might tell you, if you're using metrics to determine if a particular rule is getting hit more, if you are getting more accounts in a particular area of they could definitely inform you, but they won't actually tell you the actual true what is happening and how it's happening. And through these, we've uncovered some really sophisticated actors through these analysis, and found that there's actual interesting but very complex cases of social engineering attacks that take place in our end. So it's, I think that unique position really helps. But what this also does is help inform the team on which area is feeling the pressure. because we have a diverse set of products that we provide and we support the entire enterprise. And so both to your question in terms of setting the budget and kind of expectations, we help inform potentially what our fraud budget may look like based on what other sophistication and the trends we're seeing in the fraud that's impacting us.
And before we hand it over to Frank, do you share that information also externally with friends in the business? Competitors of yours, I guess, right?
We partake in, and actually I've seen this increase over the past probably couple of months. We're partaking in multiple communities that are kind of coming together through different vendors. So like different vendors organize these communities of fraud professionals. They come together and they have these meetups, I would almost say, where we can come together and talk more on a saloon style discussion of like what is happening. But we've also kind of taken the proactive approach there by leveraging like FS-ISAC community to reach out and see, well, is anybody seeing this? What are you doing about this? So yeah, I think that we're definitely moving in the direction of like getting closer as a fraud fighting community and through these different forums. I would love to see something kind of bigger, and I think the event that took place at Fintech Nexus, the Fraud Fighters Club.
Fraud Fight Club.
Excellent. That was excellent.
Wasn't it good? I'm so glad we put that on. Yeah, PJ and Ron did a great job. I'm glad you found it useful. We love it. Yeah, and we will replicate it somehow. I don't know if it's going to be at Fintech Meetup or not. If it's not, we will find a way to make it happen again.
Yeah, interesting, Maria. So, Bo, to your question for us, let me start with the data. One of the things that we think is really critical, and Maria, you mentioned it, is the idea in today's world of a black box approach just doesn't work anymore. You got a team like Maria sitting at a customer, and our view at Arcos is that we should provide them all of the data elements and attributes that we use to measure attack vectors, and also to how to challenge those vectors, and let them ingest that and use it. And the value of that data from a provider's perspective is that it's curated from a broad group of clients, no PII, nothing personal transfers, but just things we're seeing in terms of types of attacks and the telltales of those attacks. What are the commonalities we see in those attacks, and what are the rules we recommend to fight them? Sharing that with our customer base is critically important, because Maria, that feeds your machine, where your team can now go back and say, hey, what happened? What did we see? What was nuanced between this attack vector and the other vector? So that sharing data, it's something that's core in our DNA, is to say, this is what we got from this interaction, Bo, and we're going to give this to our customers as they go through their, kind of identity resolution and mitigants, to say, this is what we saw. Now you use it, and then we're able to help you understand what that means and how to interdict against it. The other thing we do that's unique to kind of our business, not only in this space, but a security operating center is critical. We use that group of people in our organization to really look at these attack vectors and become predictive, and to be able to say to people saying, hey, this is coming. How do you, be aware this is coming? We do that for our customers because oftentimes, Maria, as you know, in your teams, you're resource constrained. You haven't got the time and energy. So having a group of fraud fighters that are dedicated to understanding the threat vector and sharing it's really important. And then most importantly, our DNA around this, Bo, is we view this fight as really a methodology for us to remove the profit incentive. It really is a multi-billion-dollar business, as we know. So our view to this is to say, make the cost of intrusion so much more expensive than the value derived from intruding. And eventually, all these people, which are remarkably good business people, will say, this is not worth it. I shared recently on a speech I was giving an actual complaint from a fraudster that had come into this forum and basically said, I pay my people $1.50 for every 1,000 solutions they can challenge. This is a human fraud farm. And if it goes higher than that, in our case, they were really saying bad things about our company. They were saying, it's too expensive. My people won't go to work because they can't make enough money. And so our approach to this is to really look at it and say, how do we create through computer vision, machine learning, AI, solutions that make the cost of intrusion really, really expensive. And so the volumetric stuff, people go, I'm just going to abandon this. It's not worth my time and energy. How do we take those learnings, give them to people like Maria so that her teams can look at them and be predictive in the future? And then how do we overlay that with a group of fraud professionals that are looking at the global network and looking at what we see as new kind of approaches and vectors that people can get ahead of, and then sharing that information. And in some cases, like SMS Toll Fraud, Maria, this is one where we started seeing it. It's been around a long time. It's just never been at scale. And we started seeing it, in the last year, and it just took off. And that was when we really started reaching out to, our community, saying, hey guys, if you have SMS anywhere in your flow, be aware, right? Be on the lookout, because this stuff's coming, and then sharing that information. So I think, Bo, we had, there was an adage in this business forever that it takes a network to fight a network. It's never more true. I mean, you have to have data. The internal fraud teams have to rely on partners, especially when you realize that I think this last year, most attack vectors, most breaches, I should say, almost 60% of breaches were attributable to weak supply chain partners. So you have a platform you're relying on, they haven't got their act together in terms of security, and now you've got a supply chain vulnerability that's feeding, that's actually entangled with your own systems, and it's vulnerable. So in that environment, we focus on really strong supply chain partnerships. How do you make sure you've got enterprise class supply chains that stand behind their product, that that they don't just provide great information, but they're there when you need them? Those are all critical elements for us.
I'm going to dive into question number 1 from my friend Stephen Avila. Thank you for joining. He asks, what are ways to inform clients on best security practices to avoid corporate account takeover or other attacks?
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
Yeah, I think maybe from our stance, what has really been helpful is just having a diverse types of media, because having just if you're just sending an email notifications, it may be overlooked. But we've had some really good success with holding webinars, having those recorded and accessible, various in-product prompts. You kind of have to be really creative, but what has helped is really within the flow. You kind of identify the points where this will be really most crucial, like at a bank account change, or when they're adding a new bank account to pay someone, and saying this can happen. These instructions could have came from someone's email, could have been compromised. You should be aware of this risk. And then, we obviously can't put a lot of text there, because then they're going to be overwhelmed and they're just going to click out and read. But we do add links, and we add prompts where they have to check mark and they said that they did take a look. And then we do this again at later points in time as well. So then it really helps educate the users. And something that this actually has been effective, because we put this in a couple of years ago. And since then we've had, we've seen in numbers that the number of cases where corporate account takeover led to a loss had gone slightly down. The overall trend has been increasing globally, right? So just by the sheer volume, it has been going up, but the scale at which we've been seeing it grow hasn't been growing as fast as just the overall landscape. It really helps.
Education does help, and you're dealing with corporate individuals, professionals who are paid to watch these accounts, right? So it's like, it's part of their job. Would you say there's increasing awareness of the threat, and so people are paying more attention? They are watching those webinars and the replays?
It's hard to say that it's really playing a role. I would say that there's a good there's a good number of businesses and enterprises that have really taken the steps to raise awareness internally based on various prompts that have been provided. But on the other end, what we've also seen is the attackers have just become a bit more sophisticated. I'll give you an example. We had added, as I mentioned, we added a message, if someone's going to be sending you instructions to change a bank account, you should be aware that the email should be, can be compromised. You should pick up the phone and call the vendor. And so what they do is call, they get an invoice, they call the number on the invoice, and the fraudster picks up the phone. They speak good English, so there's no concern in terms of okay, my vendor picked up the phone, but the person working in the accounting department doesn't know what the vendor really sounds like. They probably never spoke with them. And so that continuum in terms of you put in controls, they adjust, they put in controls, they adjust, they're just really becoming more sophisticated, because for them, the incentive is so huge. and that there's no deterrence. And so they were willing to go the extra mile to have somebody in there available to pick up the phone at any time when somebody might call and verify, did this bank account like change get requested?
Yeah, it's interesting, Maria, you said that. I was reflecting on the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, and we had heard from very reliable sources that the initial emails went out 30 minutes. On that Friday, when the regulators took over the bank, within 30 minutes, there was emails out there saying, hey, we were part of Silicon Valley Bank. You know, this is our new bank account number. Please vector money here. And so I think it's really interesting. They're creative, they're opportunistic, and they're ready. Right? They're not, it doesn't take them weeks to adapt. And so I think to your point, that idea of training and education, Bo, is super important in avoiding these things. And also just realizing, you know, understand that your adversary is out there. You asked me the question earlier if we're winning or losing. You know, we think we're winning, obviously, because we have a great partnership with organizations and so forth, but it's an expansive dynamic space. So it is an arms race. You know, I adapt new weapons, they come back with new weapons, and off you go. So we're not at a state of détente yet, but we really are in a position where we have to share this knowledge and then have our people be aware. Because to your point, you know, Maria, think about it. In the past, you would pick up the number, you'd go, oh, okay, the email was bad, but I called my bank. But if they're spoofing the number, right, and they're intercepting the call, you got bigger challenges. So I think, to me, really understanding as a practitioner to get your people ready to understand these kind of seminal events that cause opportunities for fraudsters. You know, that bank failing, every single company that banked at SVB suddenly needed a new bank account. And just imagine, multiply that by the thousands of tech companies and hundreds of thousands of customers from whom they collect, right? Suddenly there was to your point, Maria, such a huge incentive to act quickly. And nobody's really come clean on how many got caught, but I imagine a lot of people got caught up in that just because it was the perfect storm of fear, of necessity, I got to get something done quickly, and the fraudsters capitalized on that. So to Stephen's point, I think you really, you know, you have to have people understand they have to be that you know, be predictive, be on a solid footing, use the right technology and partners, analyze the data, and Maria, to your team, listen to your fraud people, right? So, you know, it's always great to get market share, but you should always, you know, listen to the people that are helping you get the right kind of market share, right? Where you're getting real legitimate customers.
A couple more questions came in, and I want to address these. If you two can read ahead, or as I read these to the audience, and the first one from Ana Luisa is about company formation. So her company, GlobalFi, does company formation services. After they form a company, they'll get a response back from that company, it sounds like, that disputes the payment as a fraud. And it sounds like it's really difficult space for them because they can't go back and undo what they've done. That's my understanding of the question. Is this something that you can address, or is this a little bit outside of scope? I just wanted to raise it.
I could take a crack at it. It's interesting. You know, the reality of new account creation is a sophisticated thing. And we used to categorize this as friendly fraud sometimes. Someone would create an account, then they go, oops, you know, I don't want to pay for it. So I think you have to have a detect technology that is sophisticated enough to understand, you know, is the same device being used, you know, even with different credentials, is it the same individual, same device, same IP range, or a series of ranges, you know, and having a good detect front end on your solution that's able to understand, you know, people that do this don't just do it once, right? So am I seeing a velocity? Am I seeing somebody or a transaction where the attributes in that transaction are emulating a new individual, but in fact, we know for a fact that it's the same device or the same range or same, you know, attributes we've seen before. So I think having that, Maria, that detect technology is probably the best way to stop that. The incentive will always be there. And the fraudsters know it's very difficult to dispute that. So to me, that detect and challenge are part of any good interdiction solution, but that detect part that, you know, in very real time assesses whether or not this is really Frank or somebody, you know, somebody else is going to be important in stopping that kind of creation abuse, where later on, you know, you've delivered the surface, now I can't get the payment because they dispute the payment. Maria, I think that's one way we would look at it, is having a strong detect feature that's able to do that.
Yeah. If I'm not misinterpreting the context, but if it's dispute on the funding side from a bank account. So somebody claiming that this transaction was on their bank account and it wasn't theirs. Having some controls in terms of like the information that you collect that lets you verify that whoever is signing up and creating the business is who they say they are. We're kind of in a similar space, right? Because like our clients are businesses, but a business will inevitably be, their account will inevitably be created by a person. But now we have to connect the bank account to the person and to the business. And it's really hard to do if in a digital space, right? Because you can't walk into a storefront and say, okay, so you have a storefront and you have clients walking in here and you do provide a service. On paper, it's very easy to stand up a business. You just go to a state registry and you sign up and there you have it. And you are legitimate on paper. But for the bank account verification, I think we've been very just kind of fortunate to be able to consume a lot of different signals from the phone number, like who that belongs to, what kind of phone number they use. Is it a consumer bank or is it a savings bank account? We don't always get that information from our vendors, but when we do, it's very important and it's very suspicious if somebody is creating a business account, and it sounds like in your case, creating a business, for meeting a business, and they're using a consumer savings account to fund that payment. So I think it's just diverse set of inputs in order to be able to evaluate, as Frank mentioned, being able to connect the attempts, like are they all coming from maybe the same attacker or a similar group, similar region?
Yeah, and it's interesting, Maria. That's one part of our DNA that really needs to be kind of inculcated in everybody, is that it's never one and done. I mean, once they do it, they go, wow, this worked, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the understanding that it is that the same individual disguising themselves as somebody else is really critical to that.
Yep.
Next question for the audience from an anonymous attendee says the speed of creation of new accounts was cited as a factor of breaches for, quote, drop accounts, end quote. And the post office box key scandal, where smaller banks take the time to verify, but the larger banks are at risk here. Do you have any thoughts on this? I'm sure regulators are all over this.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because in these large organizations, look, understanding if Frank is really Frank or Frank is the person signing up for this account is critical. It's also very expensive. Maria, you'll probably know this, in a lot of IDV workflows, you get even right down to, I want to tie Frank to a physical real world document. Is this really, him? And that's an expensive proposition where you have to go in and capture a document, and you have to understand, am I really getting the right information? Am I authenticating the document or the identity on the document? And I think what winds up happening, it's a little bit of crossover, Bo, from the last question. These synthetic accounts, what happens is a lot of these probabilistic engines rely on known social attributes, right? Especially at smaller organizations where they go, hey, do they have a business name? Or do they have a business account? Do they have any social presence? Do they have a LinkedIn account? Each of those attributes adds an element of authenticity in some of these rule models and engines to the identity at play. And what winds up happening is if you rely too much on that, right, you're going to be vulnerable because they appear to be legitimate. When you then layer in the fact that in a lot of these banks, especially on things like bust out fraud, what they're really after is the fraud's trying to establish what appears to be a legitimate relationship that will monetize over a long period of time. So I'm going to open up an account, do some stuff with it for 3 or 4 months, get some credit built up, get a credit card issued by the bank. Everybody's happy now. And then in month 5, 6, or 7, I maximize a $10,000 credit line they've given me and I vanish into thin air, right? And so I think big banks are at risk of, introducing more friction because they're more highly regulated. The opposite side of that is small banks are at great risk of, false negatives, allowing people in that aren't legitimate customers, and then ultimately having those people as perpetrate a fraud. So I think to me, it goes back down to, do you have a solution that can, first of all, bifurcate, robots from people, and then within the people, are those people legitimate, or are there attributes in their transactions where we'd go, hey, this is an individual on what we call low and slow attack, trying to, create an account for future compromise. I think it creates a tension, but I think that same detect, understanding who they are, and really getting deep on the identity is probably the first step, Maria, in my estimation, in solving it. Eliminate the bot so it's not scripted. Eliminate the fraud farm so it's not slow and low. And now when you get there, you kind of get a sense I'm dealing with a real individual, and then your normal IDV efforts can kick in.
Yeah. So interesting to that point. I was thinking back to a study that I read. I unfortunately don't recall the source somewhere, the source of that study, but they are estimating that about 3% of all bank accounts open in the United States are mule/drop accounts, which just speaks to the sheer level of problem that this poses. And they facilitate the movement of fraudulent funds. Fortunately for us, we don't necessarily, we're not a financial institution, so we don't kind of directly get impacted by this, but what we do see is indirectly this does increase in terms of like what we're seeing in terms of like the victims of scams who unwittingly or unwittingly setting up accounts on behalf of someone else, and they're being kind of fully engrossed in it, maybe a romance scam or any other kind of scam, and then they're kind of facilitating the money movement of someone else. But I think what is really crucial is understanding the behavior and transaction pattern of what a normal good customer looks like, and comparing this to the likes of someone who's kind of facilitating the money movement of fraudulent activity, because they're just going to have larger transactions that are coming in and they're going out. They're not going to be doing shopping at Starbucks, or they're not going to have the regular activity that you would normally see in for a good user. So I think it's a big problem for sure. It's only going to continue to be ramping up.
Yeah, what's interesting, Maria, in that case is exacerbated by the fact that oftentimes the account holder is a willing participant, right? They get a small piece of the transaction. You're a starving college student somewhere and somebody says, hey, let me use your bank account and I'm gonna leave 2% of whatever flows through it. That's another challenge, because now you have the idea that a customer is good until they're not, right? So if you're in this situation, you get a great deposit, a great bank customer, and then that individual falls either wittingly or unwittingly prey to one of these mule schemes. That's another issue. And to your point, at that point, the context of the transaction matters, right? If you think of the online, who you are as the first predicate we have to answer is Frank, really Frank. The second predicate is Frank operating normally in the context of this transaction? And if all of a sudden you've got a college student that has had very little activity in their account, and now you got big ins and outs with small, drops left, that's another one where it exacerbates it, because that's a willing participant in that muling activity. Probably not really understanding what that really is all about, because ultimately, as we know, a lot of really nefarious activities are financed that way. But just somebody who opportunistically says, hey, I can get $3 on every transaction, why not, right? Rent my account, basically, right? Which becomes a real challenge.
Yeah.
Stefan asks, as a new peer-to-peer payment app, it's imperative that we develop with security in mind. What advice would you give for a bootstrapping fintech company on how to strategically make sure we are keeping threats in mind and the best ways forecasting for these threats? That's a great question.
There you go.
There's a
You
lot.
want to go first?
Yeah, there's a lot to consider.
Do you want to just give them your cell phone and
There you go.
we'll take this offline and you can spend 3 or 4 hours? Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, and I think first important point is to consider like what it is that specifically you cater to, or like to kind of to understand where your good users, why good users would be coming to you, like why good users would sign up for your service, and what you would expect those users to look like. And when you're thinking ahead, you're going to build around like what you would expect, again, like not knowing the context around like what the business provides or like what it caters to, but having understanding of what you expect and building anomalies that gear kind of based on what your norm is, based on geography patterns, based on transaction amounts, dollar amounts, the velocity, the types of kind of spend activity you would expect. There's a lot to consider, and like all of these signals that you can imagine, they all play a role in combination, like what kind of carriers maybe persons or users are using, what industry they're coming from. There's definitely a lot to unpack, but all of the features that you may be obtaining about your signups would be playing a crucial role in you being able to detect what's normal, what's not.
I have another way to ask the question.
Oh, sorry. I would just add to that quickly that the other thing I would do in that situation is really help the budget owners understand the ROI of security. Because, to your point, the amount of money, Maria, that your team would spend on interdiction and putting solutions in place pales in comparison to the potential losses. And oftentimes that imbalance isn't reflected properly internally, where someone goes, hey, if we don't put this in, right, and we start having peer-to-peer fraud, our reputation's toast, people will stop using the platform. And so you may spend X amount of dollars, covering this through technologies, through processes, through whatever. Recognize that this has to be baked into the overall ROI, because again, where people really are always fascinated, we see this constantly with new customers that come to us, they go, well, we didn't anticipate that this risk would cost this much money, and it winds up costing a lot. So I think another important thing in that situation, as you're building that platform and you go to the budget owners, highlighting the necessity for robust security in advance of launching. People might say, well, we don't need it yet, but you really do, because the minute you launch, you're global, you're online, you're a target. And I think selling that. So Maria, this is a shameless way to have your people give you more money, but getting going to the budget owners and saying you really have to fund these initiatives properly, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And having that mentality is going to be important.
That is so true, Frank. It's really, as the last said, it's not a matter of if, it's going to happen. And focusing in on like the reputational risk, especially as a newer company, right? Like a reputation really matters for anyone. But if you're just coming in, I think it's like really key. And you could draw on like being able to promote your product through security, like saying like this, we take this seriously. So, clients who come to you may be taking this really into precaution, really thinking about upfront. And I think what's been effective for us is kind of doing, anytime we have a new launch or a new product or a new feature, we do a product risk assessment with our strategy team and think about all the creative ways of how this can be. How can this be abused, or how can the fraudsters really take advantage of this? And what do we need to think about putting, like, what kind of controls do we want to put in place to be able to detect it? So kind of like, you have to really exercise your creative mind there. But thinking about the scenario, kind of putting yourself in the shoes of the fraudster and kind of doing that exercise, it helps. It definitely helps.
And Maria, one thing to highlight, I say this obviously because you're one of my supply chain partners, is the importance of picking the right partners. A lot of times these new companies try to go cheap or try to go with someone who's going to really provide a service for far less money. And they don't understand that rigor you just talked about of reverse engineering fraud, of understanding that the touch points is really, really important. Obviously, we Arcos do the same thing. We want to highlight the fact that you want to rely on people that are deep in this fight and really get it, and not cut corners. Because again, if you cut corners and you don't have that rigor on the other side in your supply chain where people are doing what you just mentioned, you're going to probably be subject to way more risk than you really want to take on.
If you're founding a P2P payment app, what employee number is your CISO?
Look, I'm a big believer, Bo and Maria, that, when you're building these kinds of businesses, especially that involve, touching other people's money, so you're involved in providing these services, that, you've got to have the right product, technology, and InfoSec people should be 1, 2, 3 in your hires. It's a matter of, if you go cheap, you're going to get hurt. And the problem is, we all know, is if you don't begin to build security into your product and design, you will create vulnerability. So I think, to me, having a CISO is a very important, first, if it's it should be one of the top 10, the first 10 people you hire, one of them should be the CISO.
Okay, let's jump into, how does the implementation of a robust KYB solution enhance the verification process when onboarding new businesses, especially for organizations working with SMBs? How does it contribute to preventing fraud in this case?
Maria, I'll take a stab at it. This is an interesting one, because the compliance part of onboarding businesses depends on the nature of the business, right? So if I'm onboarding a business in the ad tech world and it's all about serving, I have a different kind of risk profile than if I'm onboarding a business that's going to allow my customers to interact with, if I'm Plaid, for example, and I want to buy a Tesla, onboarding those guys is a different kind of deal. So I think, to me, the KYB part of it is critical. The same signals we use. We heard about just one of the questions earlier about, hey, what do you do when a purported business opens up a bank account? That same rigor around, are there velocities here that are unusual? Have we seen this before? Because again, a fundamental tenet of a fraudster is it's never one and done. once there's an exploit, they get there. So to me, I think understanding where have we seen the point of registration? What does this look like? Is this something we've seen before? There's something anomalous in it, in that registration, and treating KYB like you do any KYC, like real strong rigor around reputation, around device attributes and location attributes and behavioral attributes, marrying that against those velocities or these scripted. Have we seen this same kind of registration by this individual or this attack vector across 7 different companies? Those all become important. And again, I think not to belabor the point, but this is so easy to do at scale with bots that you begin to develop signatures and footprints and fingerprints where you go, I've seen that before. A lot of what Maria talked about in her team is looking at those, breadcrumbs, if you will, and saying, oh, this is something I've seen in the past. So I think your KYB, as you're looking at, the business that you interact with, the supply chain you interact with, it's as they register, the way if they're registering online solely, what does that look like? I always take it a step further, Bo Maria, as I look at the supply chain, who do they partner with? What do I know about them? Right? Now that can't happen in real time, but it can happen certainly as you're dealing with a business, a supply chain partner, and then you're having questions about how much credit and business to do with them. That can be further down the, down the workflow, where you can begin to say, hey, I'm not going to take as much risk as I would because I don't really understand these folks. But I think that rigor around velocities and where have I seen them before, Maria, in my estimation, is a really good first start. Treating any business like any other customer.
Yeah, I think this problem is something we're closely familiar with. Most of our clients are SMBs, and we are subject to all the regulatory requirements of KYB. So we have to know our businesses, we have to know our customers. I would say using strictly the information from KYB vendors in terms of like, is this a real business? Does it exist? Does it have an active registration? How many employees does it have, et cetera, that's available through various third-party vendors is not enough, because that information is publicly accessible and it is something that is just, it's not tangible. It's not like verifiable, like to what Frank had alluded to, like their reputation in terms of, do they have a website? Do they have something that can tell us that they're actually functioning and they're in business and they actually provide services? But also, is the person or the entity who's creating this account, do they own this business, right? Because it's very easy to steal the identity of a real existing business. And this is where you have to really combine all the data points together. Like, is the person who's creating this account, are they located in the same vicinity area where the business is located? Is this person who they say they are? So you not only have to do the KYB, you have to do the KYC, but also the behavioral attributes, because the things on paper alone are just absolutely not enough anymore. And we've seen this actually, one of the biggest signals we rely on is signals around email. How long this email has been around, and what reputation has it had? How long has the domain been registered? And nowadays, you don't know if someone's email is compromised. So it doesn't matter if the email was created 10 years ago. If it's compromised, it's as good as it created yesterday. And so you have to really couple that with other factors and, has this email been seen with this IP, and has it been seen with this device, and has it been seen in combination with all these other factors? It really plays a really crucial role, because like to what we talked about earlier, the sophistication is increasing and fraudsters are exploiting further ways to monetize the data that they get their hands on. We used to see kind of, the BEC being perpetrated just by interception of invoices. Now they're just taking the email that they hacked, and now they're exploiting it further to collect other PII details and using all that information to sign up for fraudulent accounts. And how good does it look if a company's legitimate domains being used to sign up? Like, yeah, I work at hq.bill.com. I created this account. You could verify I have access to a corporate email. That unfortunately is becoming less and less meaningful.
It's interesting, Maria, too. What really drives that again is, if think about it, it's a profit motive, right? So if you're the person onboarding that business and it appears to be legit, why not? I mean, I'm going to make more money. So I think the fraudsters have figured that out. And to your point, there's so many interesting things, Bo, that come from these attributes. If you've never seen an email before anywhere in the network, anywhere, this is where these kind of, where someone like Arcos, we look at our global network, and this is the first time we've ever seen that email. It's suspect immediately. You go, wait a minute. And then if that brand new email is suddenly seen being used to register a bunch of different places, that's a pretty good idea that you've got fraud. So even little signals that we just take for granted, like email, can tell you a lot about the nature of that transaction. And to your point, Maria, not to be complacent on emails that have been around forever, because What used to be a get into the account, grab information and go, now is use the account. And that's a different level. So yeah, it's a very very interesting challenge, but one where that signal strength is just part of the fight.
Before I move on to what may end up being our last question, but we'll see how that goes. I want to make a plug for a virtual event that Arcos is putting on later this month. I'm putting it in the chat. And it has a link. And if those on the webinar want to just go ahead and click that link and check it out. It's called Accelerate, and the subtitle is The Network Effect in Cybersecurity. So it looks like a great event. It's coming up next month, late next month, and everyone should go register for that. Our last question is, other than limiting the amount of virtual debit/credit cards on an account, do you have any more best practices for combating return fraud? For example, high volume Walmart/Amazon purchases and returns where the fraudster takes the product and the refund.
Yeah, Maria, to me, this is interesting because to me, everything starts with onboarding that actor, right? So the behavior, once you're into refund fraud, they're using cards, they bought products, they now understand the refund kind of mechanism and motion. To me, it starts with, is Frank really Frank? I mean, as I get this individual in, and then obviously when you start to see some velocities in activity that are unusual. But if I go, by the way, this is no longer just online. I was at Home Depot the other day where I'd been, I bought something 3 or 4 months ago, tried to return it, and they wanted to stick my driver's license into the machine to determine whether or not I've been returning the frequency of returns over the last month. So it's manifesting itself as you buy something online, go to the brick and mortar store and return it. And even they are starting to realize the best way to understand if that's legit is what are the velocities around returns. I think you can avoid that up front, or at least mitigate it up front, by making sure you're onboarding legitimate customers. This is not somebody with a scraped credential or a bogus credential or pretending to be somebody else. That's probably the best interdiction, is to start up front. But then once they're in, is understanding those velocities and interdicting quickly is going to be important.
Yeah. Maybe what there is seeing if you could establish a connection between these. Yeah. Because if there is a pattern, there may be like a ring of actors who are acting together, and there may be something that connects them that you can leverage as well, such as any attributes that can identify them.
I want to make sure that we leave enough time for you to provide your contact information, if you're comfortable with that, for our audience to be in touch with you. We've already had one of our participants offering equity for a talented advisor who wants to jump on board. So, I mean, this is the value of the FinTech Nexus Network, people. I mean, like, it's great. Yeah,
I know, it's a great community for sure. Well, look, Maria, let me start by saying always awesome catching up. You've been at this a long time, helping companies fight these fraudsters, and I'm grateful for you and for people like you in the community that joined today who are in the fight with us. It's a pleasure collaborating, Bo. Great group, great community. You can reach out to us at arcoslabs.com. We've got a lot of great tools and knowledge base there. I encourage you to attend Arcos Accelerate. It's our venue where we once a quarter launch and talk about what we're seeing in the marketplace and some of the mitigants that we think can help. And we always have great speakers. But reach out, hit me on LinkedIn. You've got my name from the stuff, so happy to reach out and deal with people. And Maria and Bo, grateful for the opportunity. Fantastic conversation as always, Maria. Really enjoyed it, and really happy to be here. Thank you for the invite. Absolutely, Maria. Last words.
Likewise, just want to say thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me, Frank. It was really great to connect. Always very excited to have a conversation with you and learn from you. It's a very exciting space to be part of. I included my LinkedIn if anybody wants to connect. Very happy to partake in conversations. This is this is great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, both of you, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and experience. It's events and activities like this that move the industry forward. So with that, we'll wrap it up and wish everyone who's fighting fraud the best of fortune. Take care, everybody. See you, everybody. Take care.